Welcome to our program. We are delighted that you could join us today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'd like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman for organizing today's event. And of course, I will introduce our two speakers in a moment. But first, I'd like to say a little bit about today's wonderful and important program. As you know, it's a book discussion, and it's a book that the Bahá'í Chair published on infrastructure, well-being, and the measurement of happiness. Of course, it is a multidisciplinary approach to describing, building, and evaluating approaches to human flourishing. And I think the book is really quite interesting because of the diverse nature of the chapters that have been contributed by different scholars. When we first hosted an infrastructure and happiness conference in 2019 at the Bahá'í Chair, we really didn't know just how important this topic would become even beyond 2019 to the present. At the time, considering happiness was sometimes viewed as an indistinct metric. But happiness is now understood as a critical indicator that tells us about humanity's health. And in 2019, we did not know the challenges that that the world would soon face, including the global pandemic, a European land war, a war in the Middle East. And we also find ourselves in the midst of what the Surgeon General in the United States and the World Health Organization has called an epidemic of loneliness. So in a moment of crumbling infrastructure and declining happiness, what we build for ourselves and for each other, I think, means more than ever. And that's why I think today's program is so important. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our two speakers to you. After my introduction, they will speak for a while, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And a reminder to our audience that today's program is being recorded. Dr. June Manning Thomas is a Centennial Professor Emeritus of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she is also the Mary Frances Berry Distinguished University Professor of Urban Planning. In 2003, she was inducted as the Fellow in the American Institute of Certified Planners. Dr. Thomas served as president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning from 2013 to 2015 and was immediate past president from 2015 to 2016. She writes about diversification of the planning profession, planning history, and social equity in neighborhoods and urban revitalization. Recent research explores the relationship between the concept of social equity and the civil rights movement, and examined the land use reactions of community organizations of vacant land in Detroit. Her books include a co-edited Urban Planning and African American Community, In the Shadows, published by Sage. I'm going to skip a few of her books and go to two of the latest ones, which is a co-edited Mapping Detroit, Evolving Land Use Patterns and Connections, and her latest book, which is a semi-autobiographical Struggling to Learn, an Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina, published by the University of South Carolina Press. I highly recommend this book to all of you. So that is Dr. June Thomas. Our next speaker after Dr. Thomas is Dr. Carol Ryff, who is the director of the Institute on Aging and Hilldale Professor of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Ryff is principal investigator of the Midlife in U.S. National Longitudinal Study, which is widely used by researchers around the world, a very impressive set of data that she has come up with over the years. She also directed the Midlife in Japan, for which she received the NIH Merit Award. A major objective of Dr. Ryff's studies is biopsychosocial integration, understanding pathways to health or illness via linkage of socio-demographic factors such as age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, with behavioral, psychological, and social factors, including stress exposures and contextual influences. Her own research focuses on a model of psychological well-being she developed decades ago, which has been translated into 40 languages and is used across the diverse scientific fields. Dr. Ryff studies how psychological well-being varies by age, educational status, and cultural context, as well as by the challenges and transitions of adult life. A guiding theme of her research is resilience, how some are able to maintain or regain well-being in the face of adversity, and what neurobiology underlines this capacity. What does neurobiology have to tell us about this? Increasingly, she is interested in how encounters with nature, which can occur in urban environments, matter for well-being and health. So we thank our two speakers for being with us today, and I would now like to turn the time over to Dr. Thomas.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be associated with this book and certainly with this panel. I'm very happy to see the result of this collaborative project, and very pleased to be invited to be a part of it. I would like to just, by way of explanation, point out that I represent a field that is very much engaged in this discussion about infrastructure, well-being, and human happiness, although it's not always using those terms. Urban planners are practitioners who attempt to make the environment better, particularly the urban environment. And so this is really not just a lifelong, but a profession-long activity to try to improve human environments, specifically in urban areas. So we're very much involved in this conversation, and yet it's still fairly a new way of framing it in terms of satisfaction and happiness. That literature from an urban planning perspective is somewhat new and somewhat growing. So this was another reason I was very happy to be involved in this. So urban planners were engaged in helping to improve the infrastructure of cities all the way back to ancient civilization. When you look at for example, the ancient city of you look at the ancient Egyptian cities or those in Latin America or China, those were people who laid out those cities in a specific way to try to encourage the health and the well-being of residents. My work has been focused on that effort in the United States, and in particular, the 20th century United States. And in that work, I've been looking for some years at not only the potential, but also some of the difficulties that face urban planners who are trying to improve human environments in this particular country. When we look at it from a perspective of social justice, one of the reasons that it's been particularly difficult is that the society itself is deeply divided. And it's deeply divided in terms of, now we think it's deeply divided in terms of politics, which is very true. But long before that, it was deeply divided in terms of race and ethnicity, and certainly income class as well. The particular reason we want to look at the role of urban planners in this process is that, first of all, planners have to work within this environment that is already deeply divided. And second of all, planners are influencing the spatial layout of cities and of neighborhoods. And the spatial layout reflects the division within society at large. So the society, because of history and because of activities over a number of years, has placed certain citizens in certain sections of cities, for example, and other citizens are in other sections. And this has been a federally supported process, a state government supported process, and also individually supported by people who were prey to the forces of the outward society or by their own personal prejudices. So we have a bifurcated environment in which planners are trying to work. So what I've devoted my career to is essentially educating urban planners. So I'm sort of in a small pond of urban planners and trying to help them understand how they, as practitioners, affect the evolution of human society. And the particular contribution that hopefully I've been able to make is to help them understand, in particular, how this bifurcation of society in terms of racial lines has affected what they've been able to do in terms of shaping better cities. So my particular chapter looks at the history of that in two particular areas. One is redevelopment, where planners try to reshape the urban context, and especially cities just before and just after World War II, using tools such as public housing and urban renewal, but then to bring that more into the present by talking about how everyday land regulation, such as zoning or subdivision regulations, continue the pattern of eventually supporting racial segregation. And that has all kinds of implications for the life satisfaction, the ability of people who are, let's say, underprivileged in some way, either because of class or because of race, to function, to flourish as fully developed human beings. I saw echoes of that in Carol's chapter when she's talking about this whole idea of what do we need to fulfill ourselves as human beings. So that's kind of what I'm looking at, except that most of my work has been looking at how one particular practice, one particular field has interfered with the need to improve the human flourishing or the life chances or the happiness of one particular segment of the population. And then at the end of the chapter, I describe some of the efforts that planners are making now. We're the people who find funds for affordable housing, for subsidized housing. We're the people who try to improve transportation systems, try to abate environmental quality issues. All those things planners are doing, urban planners are doing in many cities and suburbs, but we're still laboring under the onus of this history, this legacy of favoritism, of lack of privilege for certain people. And so this discussion of what does it require to create better urban environments for all people is a very important one. How can we promote social justice? How can we promote better health, better satisfaction, better life chances? What are some of the tools? And some of the tools are, of course, not only improving the physical environment, but also supporting communities, supporting the full range of needs of human beings, including social needs, spiritual needs, health-related needs. And that's what I was thinking about in this particular chapter. So that's about as brief as I can be, but hopefully that offers some insight into the purpose of the chapter.
Thank you so much for that brief introduction. The chapter gives much more information, so I really encourage the viewers to get the book and read these chapters. I will now turn the time over to Dr. Carol Ryff.
Thank you, Hoda. I'm so pleased to be part of this seminar, and I was delighted to be part of the conference that preceded the book. As it turns out, the whole set of experiences led me to expand my own scholarship in some ways that I found satisfying, and I hope are worthwhile for the field. So basically, I wear two different hats as a researcher. One is that I'm a so-called expert on the study of well-being, happiness. That has become, as Hoda conveyed, it's prominent in studies everywhere around the world from many different fields. And many of our indicators of happiness go back to the ancient Greeks. And they, I think, distinguished between feel good, what they called hedonic kinds of happiness, which have to do with life satisfaction and happiness. But Aristotle also wrote about another kind of happiness using a word, strange word that nobody can say or spell, called eudaimonia. And that perspective, along with various theories from clinical, developmental, and existential psychology, are more central to my approach to well-being, which really is about the extent to which people perceive that they are able to realize their potential as individuals, to lead meaningful and purposeful lives, to have a sense of mastery in the environment around them, to have good quality relationships with other people, and to feel a sense of autonomy. So I developed measures to assess those things, and they're being used widely. The other hat I lead, which was part of the introduction I received, is I'm principal investigator of the MIDAS, Midlife in the US National Longitudinal Study. And that is a study where we're really doing multidisciplinary science. So yes, we assess people's well-being, but we link it to major sociodemographic factors, their age, their educational status, their race, their gender. We also link it to their stress exposures, what kinds of difficulties they are up against. And importantly, we link those categories of things to hard medical outcomes, that is, biological risk factors, cardiovascular risk factors, inflammatory markers, stress hormones, a wide range of disease outcomes, and of course, how long people live, mortality. And what I want to say that I think is an extension of the priorities emphasized by June is that many of the publications from MIDAS, it's a public use data set available to investigators all over the world. We just passed the 2,000 mark in terms of number of publications. Major themes in those publications are health inequalities. How do they come about? Where are they coming from? As well as racial disparities in health. So let me get to my contribution to the book. First of all, it was informative for me to actually learn that 80% of the population in this country is urban. And so it's very relevant to pay attention to urban contexts. And Midas has some handles, not great, but nonetheless some handles on neighborhood effects on health and well-being. And so I summarized some of that prior research showing that people who perceive decline in the quality of their neighborhoods over time, which tend to be more Black and more low education people, they also show lower reports of well-being. In addition, people who perceive that their neighborhoods are not safe show higher levels of biological risk factors. On the other hand, neighborhoods characterized by higher levels of socioeconomic status are neighborhoods where we see better cardiovascular health. And I just want to underscore that perceived discrimination is something we assess very carefully, and it's a part of the story. But for the volume, I'm a nature nut, and I really wanted to go in the direction of thinking about green spaces in the urban environment and the extent to which they might actually be important contributors to human flourishing, human well-being. Those ideas have been around for a long time. E.O. Wilson wrote about something called biophilia, which is basically saying in evolutionary terms that in order to survive through human history, we have had to evolve with a strong connection to nature. Our natural environments are always an important part of our survival. But in the present era, there's also whole fields. There's a field called ecopsychology, which is basically studying how encounters with nature nurture both hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. For the book, I dug into the literature about city parks, which in something I read were beautifully framed as the lungs of the city. I love that metaphor because it was also linked to scientific findings that parks are where people get physical activity and they mix it up and mingle with others. These kinds of things contribute importantly to their health and well-being. Important questions that I don't know the answer to, I don't know if it's in the literature or not, is the extent to which city parks are frequented by people of different SES backgrounds, different race, ethnicities. Are they places that attract all varieties of people from the city? I spent a little bit of time reading about Frederick Olmsted, who's a pivotal player in the history of this country. He designed Central Park in New York, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and from the 1850s to the 1890s, he had like 500 different commissions where he was developing parks in major cities all over the United States. An interesting question is, how do we think those places might actually impact people and their well-being? And to think about these things, I actually draw a lot on the arts and humanities. So some people would argue, as has Mark Edmondson, who's a professor of literature at the University of Virginia. He talks about how we read great literature to nourish inner vitality, and he gives an example of a famous poem by Wordsworth called Tintern Abbey. And at the time, Wordsworth was living in a city. He felt pretty down and out about his life. Things were not going well. And he returned to this place of his youth, a beautiful place in nature. And it gave him all of this insight about how we can actually be nourished by nature. It turns out his poem had a powerful effect on the life of John Stuart Mill, who in early adulthood believed that basically he didn't have happiness, which was the sort of core objective of utilitarian philosophy. And in order to find his way to happiness, he immersed himself in a lot of great poetry, including Wordsworth's poetry about nature. I also talk about Alexander von Humboldt, who was a major German explorer of South America. You might think of him as mostly somebody who's mapping the physical environment, but he was deeply influenced by the Romantic era in which he lived, the 1820s to 1850s. So he was a great believer in the power of poetry, much of which is about the natural environment. Lastly, I would say other parts of the urban environment that I think have the potential to really nourish human flourishing are museums. And in fact, art museums. Much great art is actually about nature. It's about being outside and seeing the beauty of of nature, the French Impressionists, for example. And in fact, much great music is also about encounters with nature. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, for example, Chopin's Raindrop Prelude. So what I was trying to do in my chapter was kind of reach into some of these new territories that for me represent an important, I would frame it as future frontier for the study of how urban environments actually influence our well-being and our health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ryff. From both of you, we have a lot of important information and important issues, and I would like to ask our viewers now to please go to the Q&A function and write your questions down for us. And I don't know, Kate, would you like to start us off with a question?
Sure, while we give people time to add some in. One of the things I wanted to ask both of you was how the pandemic changed your thinking on the topics of your chapter. Has it brought up any new ideas or challenges? Were there things that happened in the past few years that have changed your approach or confirmed your approach to in relation to how the pandemic changed society?
Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to say something about this. We have actually made experiences of the pandemic a central focus in the Midas study now, under the heading of hardships of the pandemic. Who experienced what kinds of hardships during the pandemic? And we had previously already zeroed in on another major historical stressor, the Great Recession. Who experienced hardships, loss of income, job, illness, tied to the Great Recession. And so basically, our hypothesis that we will be testing with future research going forward is that the effects of the pandemic were not distributed equally across society. The people who experienced the worst hardships, whether it was homelessness, food insecurity, job loss, they were people who were already vulnerable. And that's a kind of thing we can get a handle on in our longitudinal empirical inquiry. So sadly, I believe that the pandemic effects may end up showing disproportionately negative consequences for the health and well-being of people who were already vulnerable. I have become sufficiently concerned about these issues that I am now writing and thinking about well-being as almost a kind of privilege that is reserved for more advantaged segments of society, which is something we should all be concerned about.
Thank you. June, did you have a reaction? June, I just wondered if you wanted to say anything to that question.
Okay, sorry, my unmute was stuck. But, yeah, I apologize. My computer is really slow today. But I think Dr. Ryff is in a better position to analyze something like that because she has an active research project ongoing that will collect specific data about that. I would just add from the perspective of everything I've already said is since mostly I've been talking about the history of inequalities and how that's reflected in the city, then the pandemic simply made everything worse. It's more entrenched than it was before. And just as one example would be the quality of public education and which school children actually suffered the most. Well, the ones who didn't have the private or the suburban school systems that were able to still meet, or the ones that basically lost personnel and therefore lost the ability to keep up with children. That research is not my own, but I've seen plenty of data to suggest that it's actually low income and minority race children that have suffered the most declines in terms of, for example, math scores. The other thing that's specifically urban that a lot of people, when you think about it, it's pretty obvious, but maybe no one has called it out before. And that is the economic health of downtown areas, which were just beginning to come back. In many cities, you saw Baltimore, Seattle, Chicago, New York, Detroit. Before the pandemic, there was a feeling that we were getting more economic activity in the form of offices, of corporations, of businesses, and the wholesale shutdown of the office culture has enormous implications in terms of tax revenue, for example, for cities. So revenue that could be dependent upon workers who were supporting nearby lunch shops, restaurants, and other activities, all of those have taken a tremendous hit. So just the general health of cities, in particular central cities, has definitely, in my opinion, declined post-pandemic and not yet recovered from all the data we've seen thus far.
I'll go to our Q&A section. Our first question: infrastructure can seem boring to so many. How do we revitalize and make exciting and more humane the topic, especially for a broader audience? Who would like?
And
June?
yeah, I've never thought of it as boring. So maybe that's because of my field, but yeah, so infrastructure, actually there are several forms, as you described, Hoda, you and Kate in your introduction. There are several forms of infrastructure. There's the physical infrastructure, there's social infrastructure. So for physical infrastructure, we're aware of things such as bridges and roads and where those are placed, as well as light rail lines. A little softer would be the bus lines, where the electricity is placed, internet cable, all those things have to do with physical infrastructure. But then the social infrastructure is much more varied, and that's important too. Like, what is it that connects people? You know, where are they going? How are they interacting with each other? So that's part of what makes it not it makes us understand that it's part of the fabric. What is the skeleton? What is the fabric of this particular urban society? How are the houses placed? How are they placed in relation to the parks? What does that mean in terms of access, the things that Dr. Ryff talked about? What does that mean in terms of access? Just as an example, speaking a little bit to this issue of parks, we have networks of parks that date back to Frederick Law Olmsted, as she spoke about. But the days of being able to buy large tracts of land and create a park are over. So what we're finding is that these cities that are older cities that have grown out according to certain patterns, there wasn't always enough parkland that was set aside for them. And a lot of that has to do with socioeconomic status. So what's the infrastructure of the park system? You know, we're finding that the infrastructure of the park system can be wanting in terms of allowing people to have access to that particular amenity. So some planning departments like New York City, they've actually chosen several of these hard and soft infrastructure systems, and they've chosen to map them out so that we can see, for any person who lives in a particular block in a particular area, do they have access to infrastructure, not just streets, not just water lines, but also parks, also schools. You know, what is the skeleton of access for those people? So I think it's exciting.
Yes.
I think it's exciting too, June, and maybe one way to make it sound, I don't know, more connected to life, everyday life, as opposed to terminology about things that most people don't spend their days talking about. I think you could frame infrastructure in terms of opportunities that people have or do not have. Opportunities to move, for example, would capture like transportation opportunities. Opportunities to do, which would get into, you know, job opportunities. Opportunities to enjoy would be something I would link with parks. Opportunities to learn, sort of the educational options in the urban environment. And then this might not be the right language, but opportunities to like inhabit, and that would get to like housing. What kind of places can people actually live in? So I think there are ways of talking about all of those things that make them not boring and deeply aligned with how we're trying to think about nurturing human flourishing.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you both. So the next question from the audience comes from Ash Ramani. Referring to Langdon Winner's article, Artifacts as Politics, access and usage of natural spaces has been historically segregated, racially or ethnically, by design, of racially biased city planners and designers. How can this embedded infrastructural inequality be addressed? Does technological innovation sidestep these inequalities, or does there need to be holistic redesign? Thank you.
Who would like to take that one?
Yeah, I can start. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So so certain cities have made a direct effort to address this problematic inequality in park infrastructure. And I started to mention New York City, but I think Seattle has also done a great job, and other cities in a different way. So, for example, the city of Detroit, which I live close to, is not able to do the wholesale, undertake the wholesale effort that New York City has launched. But what Detroit has done, which is quite interesting, is it's focused on its riverfront. And so it now has a pretty extensive riverfront network along with bike paths that are now leading into the heart of the city along old rail trails, pathways or tracks. So that's actually probably the best that can be done in Detroit, which in some ways has too much green space and not enough park space, because the green space is vacancy, vacant land rather than parks. But New York City, as I was explaining, they've actually undertaken an effort to map out circles of access for their residents. And they've undertaken this over quite a few years now. And sometimes when they can't actually wedge a park into a neighborhood, what they've done is they've taken things like old baseball diamonds or old basketball courts, and they've redesigned them into playgrounds or something that's more accessible to families. And actually, a good friend of mine, Mitch Silver, was the head of their parks department. And during his tenure, he really took the lead in trying to do that, and trying to make the accessibility that Dr. Ryff talked about possible even in New York City, which you would think would be among the most difficult of places. So there are efforts that are underway. Some of them are more successful than others, but we are now developing a body of knowledge about how to cope with the land uses that we're kind of stuck with from the last century and the century before that, and to create something that is more amenable to this idea of natural space that's not vacant land.
Those are really helpful examples, especially the New York City example. Dr. Ryff, would you like to say anything?
I really have only one thing to say that is more an example of artifacts as politics. So some years ago, I read an excellent book called Heather McGhee, called The Sum of Us. And she is very concerned about public policy, particularly as relates to issues of racism and, you know, fixing the long-standing ills of this country. And she gave this incredible example of in the era of integration, efforts to integrate, public pools were open to everybody. I think the name of that chapter, I don't know if it was the name of the chapter, but basically there was so much racism in that environment, they chose to drain the pool rather than actually have children of different races come to swim in that pool. I thought it was a dramatic example.
Thank you for that. Let's see, our next question. How does one measure well-being or happiness via an index? Dr. Ryff, you want to start with this?
Is it possible the person could explain what they mean by index?
I can ask.
Yep. Okay. So shall I go on, Kate, to the next one? So the next question, my question is about AI and watching the United Kingdom postal scandal confirms for me how computer use is causing a lot of anxiety and stress, especially fears of fraud and economic loss. The book, The Wanderer Society, has helped me. Sorry, that's not a question, but do either of you have a comment about this?
Oh, I'm glad to hear that somebody else is watching Mr. Dobbs, I think, via the post office. That's on Masterpiece Theater. I
Yeah.
think that's what he's referring to, and that is an excellent. That's an excellent. I think, yeah, I only have to say that I think we're all concerned with
Mm.
the potential dehumanization of life that technology offers. And I love the section of Dr. Ryff's chapter when she talked about how to counter that with poetry and with music and culture. But yeah, this is a big challenge, I think, that's facing us. And we'll have to be very much aware of how to address that. One of the things I mentioned in my chapter, one of the things I noticed in Dr. Ryff's chapter is she talked about the resilience of African Americans, that even in certain situations where there's always disadvantage, unfortunately, there's still resilience. And I've written about that resilience. I've written about it in the context of my own upbringing and my family upbringing. And I think a lot of that has to do with not allowing society's whims to totally govern our lives, but to turn to our families and to turn to our spiritual communities, our faith communities, as a way of insulating us against the dehumanization of society. And when I read that, Dr. Ryff, in your chapter, that's what I thought of. I thought of my own family and just the different ways I've seen, in particular, African American communities arise and resist the pressure to fail. And so I think at this stage in contemporary society, we have to think about what are the ways that we can resist efforts to turn us into automatons, into slaves of technology, and fully realize our human potential.
I would just add that within the university, there, as one might imagine, there's a great deal of discussion about AI. And I think much of it needs much more compelling framing from a perspective of, I would call it virtue, ethics, morality. For example, the use of Chat GPT to write your term papers as a student essentially means you are getting an artificial education. You are not learning what it actually means to read and integrate and write and organize. So I think the risks, at a level of what constitutes real human achievement and what constitutes, someone mentioned the word fraud. One can end up with an artificial education.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have the follow-up on the index question.
Okay.
And so it was more to do with, is there a systematic methodology for measuring happiness?
So sorry. I've been doing this for so many decades. You'd think I would get it. The answer is yes. And vast amounts of time and effort go into, essentially, you develop questionnaires. You generate self-report items that, for me, come out of the definitions of each of the 6 dimensions of well-being that I study. And then you subject those items to enormous psychometric evaluation to establish convergent and discriminant validity and reliability. There are all these sort of ways in which you jump through scientific hoops to pare down your items to the best set of items that validly and reliably assess these components of well-being. I'm not saying it's perfect science. It isn't, but I don't know of any kind of science that is perfect. But it is rigorous. And lots has been published about it.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is from Mr. David Hansen. Happiness indicators seem, by their nature, to be well suited to describing the individual and more psychological, having their greatest strength in understanding the individual. The averaging over groups weakens their strength. Well-being is nearly always measured in terms of interrelationships and sociological in nature, giving profound societal insights less useful in understanding the individual. How do these two approaches collaborate and differ in designing your research activities?
I'm happy to offer some initial thoughts on this one. The whole point of the MIDAS study at the most general level is to bring together individual level assessments with societal community assessments, socioeconomic status kinds of assessments. So basically we come at these things, I think, in ways that integrate individual experience with an individual's position in the socioeconomic hierarchy, the kinds of neighborhoods that they live in, which can be arrayed in terms of safety, danger, socioeconomic status of neighborhoods. So basically, I don't see any difficulty whatsoever in doing this kind of integrative science that puts together individual level indicators with other kinds of indicators that are also assessed at the individual level. Everybody has an educational level, everybody has a race, ethnicity, everybody has an age. But those factors can be combined across the sample so that we can really talk about broader effects related to socioeconomic status, or broader effects related to the experience of aging, or broader effects related to race, ethnicity. That's about all I have to say on that.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas, would you, anything on
No,
this?
that was her question, I think.
Okay, okay.
No, thank you.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Neda Moayad. Is there data about any lower socioeconomic status urban communities which have mobilized resources to improve infrastructure for natural spaces for the better? I think you've given some examples of this already, but maybe there are some articles or materials. And are there any models that you've seen that could be shared with other similar communities in terms of success?
So I could start with that. And yeah, I think the whole community development literature, there is a literature there's actually even a journal of community development, specifically addresses this issue of how people can band together and improve their environment. Also, I think significant portions of the environmental justice literatures. So there's a literature of people who have tried to come together and use their own resources and their own agency in order to make major improvements to their environment. I actually happen to teach in a program where which is not dissimilar to other urban planning and architecture programs around the country, in that we would actually work specifically with neighborhoods and with community organizations to assist them in trying to make such improvements. And so it was really a wonderful experience for my students, but also for myself, because we would attach ourselves to a particular neighborhood or community organization, and then we would offer some skills that would help them to envision what needed to be done to improve some small aspect of their community, such as protecting themselves against squatters, or assessing which houses needed to be torn down and communicating that to the local government, or figuring out how to improve problems such as flooding and water retention. That's sort of a strategy for urban planning classes around the country. We even had a network of us who did that kind of work. But I think even apart from affiliation with urban planning academics, communities on their own, there is a network of communities that on their own are coming together at the neighborhood level, or at the congregation level, or some other aspect, some other social level, to improve their own communities. So yes, everything that we've described in terms of conditions and inequality and those kinds of things, those are meta trends. But on the ground, people are doing their best in many cases. They asked for an example. Well, so in Detroit, for example, I don't know if I should call out the neighborhood names, but I could name specific neighborhoods that we've been studying that have actually done a pretty good job of that for themselves.
Okay. Kate, is it your turn?
Yes, so I had a follow-on question for that after you mentioned flooding as an issue. And so I'm wondering what links you have both seen between nature, climate change, infrastructure, and happiness. So how is climate change in particular impacting on urban planners, for example, or on people's experiences of well-being?
Dr. Ryff, could you take that first, maybe?
Yikes. I really have nothing to contribute on that front. Incredibly important front. We don't have any handle in the Midas study on, and we would be asking it at the level of people's perceptions of climate change. It's an omission, definitely an omission.
How can I describe this? What has happened with this segregation of opportunity is that the least desirable sections of land in cities, within cities or urban and rural areas, have often been relegated to the least privileged people by race or by socioeconomic status. And so that's not only in terms of water, but also in terms of environment. And that's the origin of the environmental justice movement. It's a protest against this. The specific issue of water, that depends on the geography. So it's been a really big issue in Southeast Michigan because of and also, of course, in Flint, Michigan, because of the age of the water infrastructure, lead pipes, those kinds of things. But also in, water goes both ways. So there are pipes that bring the water into your house, and there's sewer lines that take it out. And some of those are collapsing in some of these older areas because of age. And so we've seen in Detroit a marked increase in flooding in the last few years. And again, this is because of the age of the system, but also because what used to be snow is now rain. And so we're getting heavier rainfalls and more problems with water retention. The biggest problem, especially in the South, has been in those areas that are along the border with Mexico. There's a whole set of studies of what has happened to those communities that are migrants, but or they are within the border of the U.S., but they have generational problems in terms of acceptance in the greater society. And there's a really strong problem of flooding in those areas, in areas like New Orleans, which is already below grade. There's even some evidence that after the latest wave of hurricanes over the last 20 years, the areas that were rebuilt after Katrina, for example, were the higher areas, which were upper socioeconomic status, and the lower areas, such as the Ninth Ward, have not been built up. Those people were flooded out. So yeah, water, climate change, and environmental justice, those are really present issues in the US. And that's not even talking about, of course, internationally, where we're seeing whole island nations becoming submerged.
Thank you. Let's see. Regarding the dehumanizing of humans attempting to come to the US, how has the sending of those who came here, sent from places like Texas or Florida to sanctuary cities up north, impacted the infrastructures who received them, like Chicago, New York, and any other cities who may have received them? This is a question from Dennis McGregor. Dr. Ryff?
Apologies, but I have nothing useful to say about that because I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
It's a great question.
Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, the interesting thing about questions is they don't necessarily ask what you know about, you know.
I know. Yes.
You know, so what I know, I can tell you what I know is mainly from the news media, as I don't have any research background, but of course I listen because I'm so interested in this issue of cities and how they're coping, and they were already coping with homelessness and problems sheltering those who are unhoused. And so we actually have a survey that takes place once a year. It's sponsored by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where they go out and they actually count. It's called Count Night. They count the homeless people that are on the streets. And so the aid or assistance is given is tied to that count. Well, when you have busloads of people coming in, you know, it's just those facilities are not just there waiting for people to take advantage of. And so there are struggles in places like Chicago and New York City that are now receiving these various places, these various people from various places. But yeah, this is something we're watching more in the news than seeing research about thus far.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question from Ash Ramani, who was fortunate to have been able to spend some time in Mexico over the past while. In terms of happiness, some studies show Mexico as having high well-being emotional indicators. One thing I observed is that due to strong family and faith community ties, there are strong interpersonal community connections, i.e. family ties, friendship networks, etc. Is this well studied in the literature?
One thing I could say that it's sort of related to that question is that well-being is in fact being studied internationally and in a major way and linked to many different other factors, such as family connection and economic status and available health care. Much of that work is actually happening through the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And I recently, which is run out of Paris, and I recently attended a big meeting of the OECD focused on happiness assessments, on well-being assessments. So they've been asking questions about happiness and life satisfaction in a lot of those studies for a long time. They're now actually interested in asking more questions about purpose in life and meaning and the kinds of things that I have been studying. But basically, when you go into the OECD findings, I mean, you do see, and we've seen some of this in public media, that some countries have notably higher levels of subjective well-being than others. And it isn't always directly aligned with like standard of living or economic indicators. And so there are ways, I think, that you can kind of compare Mexico with other countries. And I think it's a really wonderful thing that these questions are now being framed in a way that compares countries, because countries differ not only by standard of living, countries differ by cultural values, and those are tremendously important things. In our MIDGA study, where we were basically spending a decade working with Japanese collaborators to study all of these topics that are part of Midas, but we were doing it in another cultural context. We learned very important, I think, and interesting things about how people don't report about their emotions in ways that are culturally uniform. In an independent culture like the US, you get a lot of messages about, it's inscribed in the US Constitution, a Declaration of Independence. This is, everybody has a right to happiness, and the pursuit of happiness is a huge part of life here. So in our cultural context, the kind of cultural message is, the best place to be is to be mostly happy, don't have much negative emotion or whatever. And that's just not true in an interdependent culture like Japan, where there are actually people who are too out there in terms of their own happiness have a different set of problems. Happiness can evoke, resentment and envy in other people. And also there's a lot of sort of cultural influences on, whether it's even okay to attribute to yourself high levels of positive qualities. Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer.
Is it my turn, Kate? Okay. This one is from Imtiaz Ahmad. How do you see climate change as multiplier to violent extremism? There is a depth of mental health facilities for climate-induced forcibly migrated persons, especially for women and children. In Pakistan and bordering Afghanistan, this made women vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremism organizations. What might be the role of higher education institution in terms of community services? I know climate isn't necessarily one of your areas, but maybe you might want to respond to that, either of you.
I think that's more Dr. Ryff's question.
I don't feel equipped to kind of emphasize the climate change part of this, but violent extremism and, higher levels of incredible suffering that's going on in the world around us now, and what is the role of higher education. I think we cannot underscore enough the importance of higher education in making the world a better place. That is about expanding educational opportunities for women around the world, you know, for disadvantaged people around the world. But I would argue that education enacted in its best form is also a really powerful place for helping all of us to understand really important concepts like justice and equity. Those topics, I think, those are deep philosophical questions, and it's very valuable to have the opportunity to learn something from, let's say, someone with expertise in philosophy about the meaning of justice. There's a wonderful book written by Michael Sandel, who I think is still at Yale, on the topic of justice. I learned a lot from reading that book. But my own sense is higher education is, this is just my values, I guess. I view higher education as our best hope for making the world a better place, across countries, across cultural contexts or whatever. I think a more educated world is likely to be a more fair and just world. And let me just say that I recently contributed a chapter to volume being organized by some people out of the University of Michigan about the value of a liberal arts education, which is unique actually to this country. And it goes back in interesting and very engaging ways about the history of the development of colleges and universities in this country, and the conception of the liberal arts education, where the point of education is not to just train people for jobs, but to basically broaden people's horizons. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote fabulous things about education is for human development, for human becoming. Yeah, I deeply believe in those ideas, and yet, history, philosophy, the humanities more generally, the arts and humanities, those are the most endangered parts of the academy as we speak, as technology kind of grows and everything pales in proportion to IT studies. And I'm not opposed to any of that, although I think we need very careful scrutiny of a lot of that. I am deeply concerned about the lack of commitment that you see in many institutions across this country, educational institutions, for maintaining very strong programs in the arts and humanities, which is where I believe people can have their minds and hearts influenced by reading about philosophy and justice and inequality and where do these ideas come from. And it's just deeply troubling to me that the liberal arts, which I think was a visionary beginning to education in this country, and it is increasingly endangered.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. As you know, at the Baha'i Chair, we're always looking for the moral perspective on everything. And of course, justice and all these values play such an important role. And I think, Carol, Dr. Ryff, what you just described is extremely important. And a true liberal education brings that out for all students who participate in that. And we hope that, you know, as higher education at this moment is rethinking its role, that perhaps there'll be more thought given to strengthening these subjects. Kate, are there any other questions?
We have one more question, which is what makes you both hopeful for the future or inspires you to continue this work despite the many challenges that we've discussed?
Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm an urban planner. I went into this field hoping that we could plan better cities. That's why I'm sitting here right now. It's just ingrained within me that yes, of course we are now an urban society, and of course we can create better places for people to live and work and play and grow up. So I also happen to have an ethos of hope that the things that I talked about in this chapter, for example, are part of the failure of the old world order, and yet I see that there are roots. There's a structure of a new world order that is arising in terms of the places that I talked about, the examples that I talked about, the neighborhoods that I work with. I see that people are resilient. People are able to look at their circumstances and to create a sense of what does it need to, what's needed to improve this particular environment. It's actually a concept of development. What does it mean to actually create a sense of development that people themselves generate and carry out? And that is not so much dependent on political atmosphere or existing poverty or wealth. That's kind of dependent on the people themselves and the way they've been able to build community and build family within themselves. And so I think there are plenty of signs that kind of forward looking is alive and well in the places where it needs to be. That's not to say that there aren't the negative forces, the destructive forces, but I think in addition, there are many constructive forces.
Thank you. Dr. Ryff?
So the things that keep me hopeful and inspired are actually things like nature. I said I'm a nature nut, and it's not just, it's not for, I don't know, like entertainment. It nourishes my soul. So there are many different ways in which I partake of nature, including just looking at the beauty of the day every day when I'm going to and from work. Those things actually nurture me in the same way. I'm a ravenous reader. I partake of the arts and humanities in deep ways all the time. They nourish me. They teach me a lot about actually other people's suffering in many instances. And I want to know about other people's suffering because I think it's a really important part of being human. I have a faith in humanity, humanism, even though, let me say, I am deeply, deeply worried about what I have witnessed in recent decades. Inequality is only getting worse. It's off the charts. In this country, the bottom has fallen out of the middle class. It's deeply disturbing, and it's affecting people's lives and well-being and even how long they live. And so I think maybe the last thing I would say about this, when we're sort of talking about, I don't know, values that we aspire to, things that concern us, I feel like I'm a privileged person. I'm a privileged person because I came from a working class background. I was able to get an education, to become, a researcher, to have some impact on my field. And I don't walk around stroking my ego about those kinds of things. I walk around thinking about how much responsibility I have, how much responsibility I have to actually try to bring into focus all of these really awful forms of human suffering that we see around us right now, because it's only by really bringing those things into focus that I think we can draw attention to them and begin to basically develop responses to dealing with these problems, including in terms of public policy.
Thank you so much to both of you. Really, we have learned a lot during this session, and of course, there's much more to learn. Perhaps the Baha'i Chair needs to think about a future conference where we take on other aspects of infrastructure, maybe a focus on inequalities, but we'll have to see. But all of that to thank both of you, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Ryff, for a very, very thought-provoking session. And we hope that, again, the audience will consider reading the book that the Baha'i Chair has published. You can go to our website and find it on there, because it's a very helpful book in terms of the interdisciplinary lens that it shines on this topic. There's the book. I don't have it with me because I'm not in my office at the time. There we go. Thank you, both of you, for showing us the book. And again, thank you for participating with us today. This session actually marks the last of our programs for this academic year at the Baha'i Chair. As you know, the academic year is coming to an end, but we will list on our website our events for the upcoming year, and we just ask you to please follow us on social media, and if you can't, to at least sign up to receive our emails, because we do send those out, which relate to our various programs that we will be hosting next year. So again, I thank all of you for joining us, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next year at our upcoming events. Thank you. Bye-bye.